Thank you so much for listening to the Talking Classical podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the Talking Classical podcast and you'll receive a notification every time a new episode is released. You can also follow the Talking Classical podcast on Twitter, on the Talking Classical blog, and on Facebook and YouTube. Many thanks for listening once again. I hope that you'll be able to join me for the next episode very soon. Welcome back to another episode of the Talking Classical podcast. I am so pleased to be able to share this discussion that I had with Thomas Hampson, one of the greatest baritones of our time. I talked to Thomas on Zoom, and as many of you will know, he is a very big advocate of digital technology. We started off by talking about Zoom. Thomas really likes using Zoom. We talked about the impact that digital technology and digital platforms like Zoom are currently having on the classical music industry in this current time, how this is impacting learning, education, and participation, as well as Thomas's current teaching with various institutions and projects. Thomas has a series with IDAGIO at the moment, a fantastic classical music streaming platform in which he's going to be exploring the art of song over the next few weeks. Thomas has a wealth of knowledge and experience in art song, and so we briefly touched on some of the questions that he's going to be exploring, such as what is it that makes classical song different from pop song, and what is it that inspires a composer to set beautiful music to the poem or the text given, and vice versa. We also discussed music criticism, something that Thomas has been accustomed to throughout his career, and Thomas shared many fascinating insights from his long and illustrious career with some of the greatest artists of our time, from Nicholas Harnoncourt to Daniel Barenboim and Leonard Bernstein. Many thanks to Jenna at Lenny Studio for very kindly helping to arrange this interview over the last few months, and also to Thomas for very kindly taking the time out of his extremely busy schedule to talk to me. So without further ado, here is my interview with Thomas Hampson.
I find Zoom just amazing, but I was looking at it with my colleague in Manhattan School of Music, Christiane Orto, who lost her very courageous battle to cancer this year, unfortunately. But we were looking at learning platforms, learning with classroom and so forth. And Zoom was, we said, oh, what a marvelous communication. Back we had actually contact with the people they're building. We said we find it a far better platform than Skype, and certainly better than FaceTime.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why Apple never got FaceTime together, because
Okay.
it should be like this.
Okay.
But Zoom anyway. So I'm glad we have Zoom, and there's so many wonderful bells and whistles. I have a full-blown license. I'm going to do a webinar with my students later this week.
Mm-hmm.
I may never leave my room here. I tell you, yes, we're staying busy. It feels, and I've tried to treat it a little bit more like a sabbatical, but I'm putting a very positive spin on it. Like everyone else, I am just simply unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
I had the month of March were 2 or 3 very special concerts in various exotic places in the world, and they were canceled as I got there.
Mm-hmm.
All the teaching that I was to do in Paris and in Heidelberg was, of course, canceled with the festivals. And the festival, the Heidelberg Frühling Festival was, of course, canceled. So that was the concerts gone in April. April and May, I should have been here in rehearsal for a new commission world premiere of an opera by Stefan Wirth called The Girl with the Pale Earring.
Wow.
Very exciting project. But in fact, Zurich decided to postpone that to the winter of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So if the Vilnius Festival doesn't cancel June, I may very well, have another work. But I pretty much put a big red X through the rest of March and all of April. Most of the countries that I would have anything to do with are in what they call lockdown, severe travel restrictions. And of course, more than travel restrictions, there are no gatherings of people. There are no public events for which I would be useful. So until that landscape changes, I am unemployed. Yes, I'm busy with IDAGIO. Yes, I'm busy with my students. We're trying to, we're building a new platform for them. I'm sort of coordinating between the Lied Academy that I'm the artistic director of in Heidelberg, as well as the Schubertwoche in Boulez, which is in partnership with Heidelberg. And that's all sort of motored through coordinated through my foundation, Hampsong Foundation. So yes, there are things to do, and it's fun to keep busy. And it's also very exciting to try and see this positive side of this is, and we've opened up for our general public a far greater, wider, deeper online presence, communication, availability, access. So I think we should try and get that right. I think that playing the trumpet on the balcony is charming as everyone else, but I think for those of us that have been interested in and busy with digital education platforms for some years now, it behooves us to take this new awareness and this new involvement, as it were, to a new and better fundamental level. And that's what I'm trying to do with IDAGIO.
I'd be really interested to talk a little bit more about the partnership that you have with IDAGIO. I actually watched the live stream that you did last week. I really enjoyed that. So could you tell us a little bit more about your partnership, what you're aiming to do? And I hear that you've got some special guests lined up over the next few weeks.
Yes, I think I can't announce the special guests.
Oh.
There'll be. I wish I could, but I can't until it's completely confirmed. The special guests. I can tell you this: that the ladies are concerned about being camera ready.
Okay.
As soon as they sign off on camera ready, we can go. Right now, IDAGIO, I've been involved in IDAGIO since they launched. Tiljan Sukovic, the founder and CEO, is a friend and colleague. And I appreciate having, the inside, being part of the inside loop of artists that are involved with IDAGIO that give feedback and are somewhat ambassadors. But I think we're going to a new level. IDAGIO has always been interested, one, in video, and also in artist-customer partnerships, meaning providing an online platform where artists can really do what they want to do and have that as their go-to place for their public, and also enjoy this catalog that is already there with IDAGIO. IDAGIO has an enormously deep catalog that's already available, and I hope to help them exploit that a little bit. It's quite fun to drop the needle and see composers' names that I never knew of. And somebody said the other day there's like 9,000 or 10,000 composers on IDAGIO, and I went, "You mean there's 9,000 or 10,000 classical music composers?" So if I'm a little bit dumbfounded by that, certainly our general public is. The timeline for a lot of this got, of course, bumped up. And it seemed a very good time to simply start trying. So I would say everything that's going on in IDAGIO right now qualifies for very high quality beta or beta. I think we'll all get better at it. Some of us have more experience being online, or especially with the radio shows I did. So it's not such a weird thing for me to talk to a blue dot in my screen. But the idea is that IDAGIO Live is literally that. Whether it should not feel overproduced. It should feel very accessible. It should feel very, spontaneous in the sense that you're having, at this point, a one-way conversation with the person. I watched Ivan Fischer sitting at his piano and just talking and playing things out of his memory as thoughts came about Mahler 1. As a musician, I responded to that quite beautifully. It felt like being in his dressing room, him wanting to talk about Mahler 1 before he went out for rehearsal, something like that. And I think people will respond to that. We need to build in the interactive layer so that people can ask questions in real time. I have two essentially different programs, and I'm feeling a little bit like a disc jockey at the moment, but I'm not. The Tuesdays with Thomas was sort of a clever title that we we laid on it, and it should be, really probably more like the WQXR drop by, visiting artist kind of thing. And tonight I'm going to have Fred Plotkin of WQXR and Singer World fame as an interviewer, and I think what he calls himself is a pleasure activist, which we'll get into tonight. So Fred will be my first guest tonight, and we're just going to talk about the world of music, our various backgrounds, music that we love, singers that we love, some old singers that should never be forgotten, and of course this new world that we're in, that we're all exploring. What does that mean to the concert-going public, the opera-going public? It's the idea behind the Tuesdays with Thomas is literally 20 minutes to a half an hour of drop by, have a glass of wine before you go to the theater or something. If we were if we were in New York, I'd say, oh, well, I know you got the opera at 8, but why don't you just pop by my apartment, let's have a drink. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. It should have that sort of easy thing about it. On Thursday, much like the other artists that are already online or have done this, and I started with the Mahler and it's more program notes. It's more an opportunity to talk about, for me, I will probably concentrate more on song. And Thursday, I'm going to discuss in some detail what makes the difference of classic song versus pop song or normal song, or why do we call it that? What is art song? What is melodie, pigeon, canto, lied? That they just break down, and then probably land with some marvelous Schubert songs, because I referred to Schubert in the Mahler program. So I think every once a week I'll have sort of the world of song through my eyes, and I can invite people I've wanted and so forth. There's the things, we're not inventing the wheel here. We should be able, when social restrictions are lessened, I think we should try and get into the desktop concerts like NPR. I think those are unbelievably fun and cross-genre. When I'm back, and I think we are reaching out to them when I'm back in America for the Met in December, that we could do one. I think it'd be great fun. I think it's a wonderful idea. So, but these things, these things have been bubbling. What has happened with this crisis is that we have expanded the online platform awareness exponentially to the public that we had always hoped would be, moderately interested in and pass by. Our challenge, it seems to me, is a couple of significant challenges. I don't think anybody has a crystal ball, but in my opinion, to date, everything that's been getting a momentum in terms of online presence has been augmenting an analog production of festivals or opera houses or symphonies, whatever, which is wonderful. Now that the analog has been stopped, we of course have this phase of jump up, and that's where we have everything being released online and people have a lot more availability. We're going to have to put part of that genie back in the bottle, which is going to be a real challenge. But more importantly, I think all presenters, whether they're concert presenters, whether it's Heidelberg or Frühling or Lincoln Center, are going to be compelled to see themselves as online and analog producers. And that doesn't seem that maybe sound obvious. In the world of online education, that's called synchronous and asynchronous teaching. Synchronous is when you're actually online teaching somebody, talking to them, and there's interactivity about it in real time. And asynchronous is even the televised class that is not interactive, but something that you can at some time decide to have a look at or work with. And in online education, both platforms are equally important. So that mentality and all of its drop downs, I think, are going to be what I think we have the opportunity now to really explore. What the business model for these things can become, I don't know. Right now, I'm treating, like I said, this time as a kind of sabbatical. And this sabbatical is giving me time to, see what potentially is possible. IDAGIO is a wonderful partner. My other organizations from Manhattan School of Music, Michigan, University of Michigan, in the educational world, and then Lied Academy or the Heidelberger Frühling and the Barenboim Said Academy and the Hampsong Foundation. Those are my sort of pools. How can I find a better synergy to be of use to the young people studying? That's my mandate right now and challenge, and it's fun. I'm learning Instagram. I know I have an Instagram channel, and Catherine takes care of that very nicely. But I've never actually tried to deal. I had a crash course reintroducing myself into my Facebook page, which is a little frightening. An awful lot of people there. All these things are a little bit like the rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. And I, being the kind of person I am, and I love being accessible, but part of being accessible is that I can also define where I'm intensely private. Mm-hmm. And what I find myself, you can be very, I'm sure everybody will recognize this. You can just sit here for 5 or 6 hours and the day goes by and you think, how can it be 5 o'clock in the afternoon? I just sat down after breakfast. Mm-hmm. And that's also a world that I think we need to address. And I like to address that with my younger colleagues as well. Time management is a very acute question in studying anything, much less music. So as you see, it all ties together. So I think it's quite fascinating.
That's so interesting, and I think that you've answered what I was going to ask you about how the classical music industry is currently using digital technology at this current time. I mean, do you think that it's going to be a temporary measure, or, as you said, do you think that the digital and the traditional methods are going to coexist, or do you think that maybe we'll all get accustomed in this phase to using digital technology? It might be difficult for people to go back into the concert halls.
The answer is yes. I think all of those, and I think probably where we're actually going to end up in a year, we haven't thought about yet. Mm-hmm. I would hope that, it's been interesting in the digital world and the gadgetry that has been invented, and of course, being a Mac person, I'm very proud of that development line. I think the iPad Pro, even the 219, we got the 2020, I haven't even touched it. But the 2019 iPad Pro is an amazing instrument. It's a small production board. The iPhone 11 camera is as good as any camera I ever personally owned. I have a DJI Pocket, whatever those things are called, mm-hmm. and the quality is about the same. It's perhaps if you have a handheld monitor, it's a slightly more still professional program. But the apps that go with it, there are apps that for video and for photo that augment what is already very good. All of this stuff has become cheaper, more accessible, and self-production is wonderful. I think that's going to really kick off more. I think that clearly what in the social infrastructure is going to have to happen is broadband. I know everybody's very concerned about 5G, and legitimately so. Mm-hmm. Security online is going to be a huge issue. There was some appalling number I saw yesterday or the day before about education in America of something like 50 something million students. And 25 to 30 million of those do not actually have broadband access. Now, that's an equation that is intolerable. So I think we've got, when I said being sort of glib to your questions, I think it's all just going to move forward, and hopefully right now, because of the compelling crisis, and I do not take this crisis lightly. I live in a very protected world and have been extremely careful. I am not hearing sirens every day. I'm not in New York. I'm over here in Zurich. I live outside of the city. I'm in a very controlled environment where I'm safe and I can step back. Watching all of this every day on the news, I'm a bit of a news junkie. And keeping track of it is an appalling, heartbreaking story. And I don't want to seem to anybody that I'm taking that lightly. I'm glad to concentrate on what this can mean to our world, but in fact, we are still deep in human misery. And so everything, back to also the IDAGIO, although we don't talk about that a lot when we do these shows, and I don't, it's not like, oh, well, let's play something sad, because the idea that we're available is because now it's time to be available. And we're available a little earlier than we would have liked to clean it up and beat it, because it just is needed.
Yeah.
And I think that's all very valid, but I think that now is the time why we are still in a forced kind of slow motion to get some of the basics right. Because if the lid comes up and lid comes off and it becomes a fast moving business model, then you're going to have a lot of decisions made on the economics, i.e. profit, which would be sad. Let's get this right. Let's get this right for once.
I just found a wonderful quote that you have said about song. You say that song is a metaphor of the imagination. It is poetic thought encapsulated in music. Poetry is driven by the basic instinct to tell the story of existence. Explain.
Well, it seems rather obvious to me.
Okay.
I'll get into this on Thursday, I suppose. I don't want to be too. My wife is always saying, don't get too, too crazy. I think, but people want to know that. If you read those sentences, it would seem obvious, but breaking it down, the word metaphor, metaphor is essentially something that stands for something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so if song is a metaphor of the imagination, then let's look at the components of song. And when I say song, and in this particular context, I'm talking about classical song, or what has always been known as art song.
Yeah.
But I don't like the phrase art song, not because it seems stuffy, but because the process of art or artification is the preservation of something. It's the capturing of something. And even Wagner talked about that. Art is a transcender. Art makes something possible to observe. But what in song is possible? Well, let's just look at ourselves. If we, as a human being, we have probably 3 essential ways to make our imagination public. We can say it, sing it, chant it, whatever. We can write it down, and that impulse has been from stone walls and caves through parchment to paper to digital ink. That metaphor, whatever's written, whatever you write from yourself as your thoughts, even just what you just read as my quote, is a metaphor of what I was thinking about. Right? So we have this, and then the third way I was going to say is that we can gesticulate. We can probably dance it. I mean, I'm seeing all sorts of images of charades and so forth. But essentially, as human beings, we are going to write it down in some recognizable hieroglyphic, or we're going to say it and manifest it in some understandable language. And this is where it gets fun, because I would say that one of those understandable languages is in fact music. And if you
it is understandable, but it isn't.
Well, music has definite syntax, and we've been playing with the structure of music for some time very seriously over the last 150 years, but music has a kind of syntax. We have cadence. We as human beings respond to, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da.
Yeah.
Everybody knows there's something else. And so we respond to that. But let's get back to the breaking out of the metaphor. So if you've got the metaphor of the imagination in words, and those words, those symbols of thought, and by the way, poetry is not information. It's informative, but it is essentially meant to, poetry and all of its guises, and I think I can be horribly general in this way, poetry is meant to ignite in the reader an association of contexts. And that's what makes poetry so powerful. And when I'm teaching young singers, if you've ever seen a masterclass, I very often say, don't give me CNN, give me poetry. Don't give me information.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't need, im wunderschönen Monat Mai. And that's a physical thing, but it's more about, my colleague Robert Hall had a wonderful quote in German. He said, Lieder hat mehr mit Aussagen zu tun als Erzählung. Song has more to do with what is being said or postulated than actually the information it's conveying.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you can break that down to ballads and whatever else, and there's all sorts of variations of that. But essentially, you've got this metaphor of the imagination that has become a descriptive word. And out of that descriptive word are these marvelously talented people who hear in their own lives and their own particular talents a language called music. And that language of music is very often more, when inspired by text, is more about what the composer feels to be the emotional context of what is being described, or the, as we say in German, the Zustand, the status of that person as they say that text. Der Wanderer an der Mond, the wanderer singing to or reflecting on, and we don't really know what that title means other than there's a moon involved. Has he just gone? Has it just rained? Is it night? Is it not night? Is it early in the morning? Have they been going a long time? Are they speaking to the moon? Is the moon speaking to them? Are they speaking to somebody, hoping somebody else will look at the moon? I mean, there's just all sorts of ways that this Wanderer on the moon can mean something, but it meant something to Schubert. Bum bum dum 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 da da dum dum da dum dum dim dum da da di da da dum. That obviously is a kind of motion in my description, but that's some kind of wandering idea. So Schubert would like to invite us into Goethe's poem to understand that this process of reflection of the moon is part of a journey, right? So just those two things invite any person listening to that or getting acquainted or hearing for the first time, invites them into their own world of associations of having ever walked anywhere, having ever looked at the moon before, having ever asked existential questions, having ever felt good or bad or wonderful or whatever. And all of that is completely the imagination of the person digesting that musical poetic moment. Ergo, metaphor, metaphor, metaphor. Mm-hmm. It's a conversation of metaphor, if you will, in a song. And what I do as an artist is not tell anybody about the moon or the wandering. I simply make that thing that Goethe thought up and Schubert put into a musical context audible. And the journey you take yourself. And this is what I think is so powerful about song. Because if you look at that process in any epoch of any culture, and we all have songs forever and will ever, is that not one of the most beautiful identifiers of any culture you want to get to know, or be associated with, or have any idea about? The idea that a song enriches someone's own successive heartbeat moments is kind of obvious if you just take the conversation that we've just had or the description I've just given. And that's why I think it's important to understand when you're listening to very constructed songs like poetry set to music, that there are layers that have been specifically layered to invite one into their own experience. And that layering and that information can sometimes seem daunting, or to the general listener, they think, oh, you have to know too much to get into Lieder, or you know, that. And I'm always trying to find ways to say, no, that's not true. It's no more or less true than listen to Paul Simon sing an African song with the Ladysmith Black Mambazo. Who's that? And who's that? And who's that? And what's that? And who are they singing that? And what does that word mean? It's the same thing. Mm-hmm. You know, great songs are great songs.
You were talking about the Paul Simon reference there. So I wonder, a lot of people talk about Lieder. One of the ways that they explain it is that it's not dissimilar to listening to a pop song.
Well, I think it is essentially very true.
Yeah.
And I have no problem with that. But yeah. It's in the same, you know, it's this. There's a difference to the Lakmé theme in the opera than when it's the British Airways commercial.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we just simply have to embrace that human beings have many layers in of themselves of intent and ergo comprehension. I can be as captivated by a Robert Ludlum book as a Agatha Christie novel, or a Cormac McCarthy, or a Harold Pinter, or a Shakespeare. And that doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but the context of how they've perhaps, just listing those off, is perhaps different access points or different associabilities. I'm a great movie fan. I don't want to know how movies are made because I need that suspension of disbelief to just go there. But I can like everything from Die Hard with Bruce Willis to I saw just a beautiful movie the other night called The Song of Names.
Okay.
Which is actually a novel written by Norman LeBrecht, of all people.
Oh,
it's a beautiful, beautiful movie. So my point is that there's different points of association. If to say that a Goethe Schubert song is no different than a Paul Simon song is not completely inaccurate. Paul Simon is a kind of Schubert of his time, in the same way that Robert Stolz in Vienna was a kind of Schubert of his time, and more closely associated because of the Austrian root and this deep belief in melody. Where things get a little bit more complicated, if you will, is if you already have a poem. Poem doesn't need music, and music doesn't need poetry. The best, and this is where I disagree with some of my colleagues, which is a fun discussion to have, to say that the best of poetry, the best of Goethe, in the best of hands of Schumann and Wolfgang Schubert, that sometimes I got to write something that's actually going to be the best of songs, and that a secondary poet can never be a best song, I think is not right. I don't agree with that. I think that the metaphoric conversation between the musical idiom and the poetic intent is what defines for me a great song, and ergo a great reflective moment. I'm perhaps slightly more ecumenical than some of my colleagues. But what I really wanted to say was a Paul Simon doesn't just to stay with him. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of Paul Simon. I'm a huge fan of Sting. I think these guys are just great songwriters. And John Prine just died, who is a great, a folk singer. I love folk music. I'm a closet country western freak. I think that the series that Ken Burns just did on PBS, The History of Classical Music, or country music, is not in and of itself just beautiful. It's also a kind of sociological history of the United States of America, and I would encourage everyone to watch it. It's absolutely wonderful. But how words are constructed to become the stuff that inspires music is a very complicated, and in a good way, just a very complex forest, if you will, of many different kinds of trees. And Paul Simon, I would never say that he spends less time coming up with his turns of phrases for his songs than Goethe did for his poem. Am I saying he's a kind of Goethe? No, but I don't think we're either denigrating either Goethe or Paul Simon by simply saying the process of choosing what words represent what you're thinking is what interests me. Goethe, as one of the greatest minds in all of history and one of the greatest poets in all of history, but at a particular time, the Goethean time, had a particular set of tools in which those choices made the largest impact. And that's also part of his time. Even by the end of his century, the 19th century, that set of tools had modified seriously in language, and the use of Goethe tools in the musical language had progressed and changed significantly. And I just find the wonder at that conversation, the wonder of how that manifests itself in any particular slot of time, the enormously interesting, personally gratifying, and yes, entertaining phenomenon of art song or classic song. So, am I going to sing country western music. Yes, I've sung, obviously. I hum along and sing and so forth. Is that what I do as a profession? No. Is that what I've trained for? No. Is it the same thing as what I do? Yes, from a heart standpoint, but style and connectivity. It's interesting that every episode of Ken Burns' series, and also his series on jazz, which is also a history of American music in America. If I had a dime for every time one of the great artists talks about telling the story, being real, being you, making the moment audible for your public, I would be a little happier about this unemployment time. I don't mean to be silly about the metaphor, but that's what we do. And in classical music, I have to admit, I think that we are our own worst enemy sometimes. There are so many fascinating levels of the creation of what we call classical music, from the very smallest musical elements to the compositional styles and techniques and voices and epochs, relationship to instrumentation, relationship to words, metaphors, all that. It's very easy to get caught up in the weeds. And it's very easy to get, certainly in vocal music, let's stay with that, you must be unbelievably detailed in your sensitivity. Your level of minutia as a study process really must be significant to understand classic song. And yet, the moment of performance, that moment of audibility, where you choose to allow yourself to make all of these minutiae spontaneously accessible. Spontaneous is a nonsense word in what I do. Is the great achievement. It must be about that moment. It's what Barenboim says. In classical music, it's not one for all.
Yeah.
It's all for one. Everything in your life as an artist, up to the point of when you decide to make that music audible, is what goes into making that music audible. And there were some early glimpses of that. I've carried that awareness from my earliest days with Hanenchor and certainly with Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein was the most prodigious intellect I ever met in my life. And yet, he was as vulnerable a performer as any 30-year-old baritone singing with him. It was an amazing experience. The unending questioning of truth that I learned from Nicholas Hanenchor and in his school of thought is, you can't know enough. It's not about taking all of that on stage. It's about enriching the things you've forgotten. I like to describe really wonderful people as he or she has forgotten more than I can learn. I sometimes use it as a sword in saying, when somebody's being terribly judgmental about gargantuan experiences and experienced artists that I adore, and say, I'm sorry, that person has forgotten more than you will ever learn. So, have some respect and shut up and realize how limited you are. And I say that to myself as well. The world of criticism has become quite banal, in my opinion. I'm not complaining about being badly criticized. I'm complaining that criticism that is not born of a discussion or informative dialogue just doesn't interest me. And this sort of pronouncement industry that we have doesn't really serve anybody's purpose other than some very, very superficial button that might be pushed by someone who doesn't know what they're reading about anyway. But that's another question we don't need to get into. And I'm not there to criticize critics. I'm just saying they have been boxed into a world that is not really very pleasurable for themselves either.
I think that there is that balance, isn't there, between constructive criticism and then destructive criticism, isn't there? And I guess also music critics, it's their job.
Well, I don't think that constructive criticism does not mean that there are not serious negative issues, but also there must be constructive criticism. It seems to me also implies a certain humility from the person doing criticism, that in their acquired sense of knowledge and position, that they simply see and hear something different than what's been given them. And if it goes so far that it really seems to be on the other side of what's acceptable, fair enough. That's their opinion. That's why they're there. But I think they need to take us with us take us with them in that process. When you see criticism that is just deeply personal or terribly offhanded, oh, that person just didn't get the fourth movement of the first symphony of Mahler or something like that. It's like, you want to say, have you ever looked at the fourth movement? I mean, getting out of criticism, it's like when people talk about Mahler's life and they'll ask me a question. Well, I understand in 1901, Mahler had this brush with death, and then goes on, what do you think? And I said, well, wait a minute, what does brush with death mean? I mean, death is a big word that kind of goes boom, and brush is something we just sort of, well, yes, there's this wonderful story you can read in biographies where the doctor said, to Mahler after he almost bled to death one night, that was a close call, Herr Mahler. Now, do you think that's just something he got up and had his Semmel and coffee the next morning and said, well, I'm glad I got through that? For one thing, the idea of brushing against anything in a context of a Gustav Mahler intellect is impossible. It either was a monumental life-orienting occasion or something that became a musical element in his mind, or it just didn't stick on his radar. And that's the first thing you have to understand about something like a Mahler or several other of these huge intellects. Einstein having a brush with his, I mean, it's just disrespectful to say these kinds of things, but it's the kind of language we've gotten very used to. And this is what I think we have to be careful with in classical music. I think we have to spend as much time as we need to and as open and as humble as possible to simply say that the world that I live in is a very complex, wonderful world, and here are the elements that have gone into making that thing happen. And if somebody wants to have that conversation, I would like to make it as painless, as simple as possible, and yet leave all of the doors open that should that person want to keep drilling down, there's just an endless fascination of detail that should be gone there. When I perform, and this is something you have to learn over the years, and I'm sure I was very guilty of it in my younger years, you can overthink things. Well, you're guilty in any years, but you want to be, you should seem spontaneous, I guess. It should very often, especially in song repertoire, it should have a feeling that you're sort of, that it's being invented and sung music at the same time. Now, having said that, is that I'm not a big stickler on Liederabende being memorized. And this is something that with Hanenchor, for instance, I mean, it's not my music. I mean, Hanenchor knew Bach better than anybody in his age and his time, but he would never dream of going on stage without the score. It would just be disrespectful. And he didn't want his singers not to have their score with him. We are referencing something that's been created to create a moment that we all inhabit. And that habit is not, that inhabited is not my moment. It's Bach's moment. It's Schubert's moment. It's Schumann's moment. Does that mean that a Winterreise is better with music or without music? It's a big question. I personally probably would have a problem. I've done Winterreise with a book in my hand, especially if I'm in between things, and you reference it, you tell it, and it had a different kind of storytelling thing. Ballads, I think you should have the music there. You're telling a story. You're reading a book. I think we should be in the leader world. I would very much like to see us open our perspectives of what is memorized or not memorized, or what you shouldn't be reading music. You should, just because you can read it from the, that's sort of boring. There should be some sort of digestion, ergo a choice on your part as artist to make that and those elements audible for the purpose of engaging another human being's imagination, ergo path to their own sense of who they are in life. That's essentially, I think, what music and I as an artist am here for.
Amazing. I mean, there's obviously so much I could ask you, but I know that you've got things to do. But I just want to ask you just very briefly. I was going to ask you about career highlights. I know that you said you had the great privilege of working with Leonard Bernstein. What would you make of this new remake of West Side Story that's going to take place? I mean, will you go and see it?
Oh, I haven't seen it. What is that? I saw a marvelous West Side Story, a new production, but also very much down the in Glimmerglass last summer, which I thought was one. And it's a marvelous score. It's a fantastic piece. What are you talking about?
So I know that they've been doing a revival on Broadway. It's very modern, very contemporary. and then also the remake that Steven Spielberg is doing.
Well, Steven Spielberg, is he doing that, or is he doing? I understand there's a some biographical film being done on Leonard Bernstein himself. Is that
no? It's a complete remake.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, look, Lenny remade Romeo and Juliet, so why not? The people you have just talked about are some of the greatest imaginative artists, producers of our time. Will I go see it if I can? Yes. It's like going to Hamilton. Hamilton just blew my mind. I mean, it was. Luca and I went, my son-in-law, and kind of, we got to the mission, and we kind of were like this, and I just looked at him and I said, I don't know about you, but I don't ever want to have to learn something like that in my life. I'm too old for this. I cannot learn that. We had a good laugh about it. It's very, very complicated music. Seems so incredibly spontaneous, but it is born of a detail that is staggering, which is a good lesson. It's caught a wonderful public imagination, and that's fabulous, and it should be, and it's a wonderful story. I would like to. I hope that there's a sequel called Madison, because I think James Madison had a profound influence on the sensibilities of our nation and its birthing and growing process that we would do well to re-embrace today. He had some wonderful and very prescient observations on the Achilles heel, the danger of democracy, which is always going to be demagoguery, the danger of mass mentality, which is always going to be populism. So I think James Madison saw in this wonderful libertarian democracy some of the envelopes that we're pushing on right now, if you will, of liberty versus security, populism versus access, voting rights versus vote getting, if you will. So again, the Hamilton story is wonderful. Madison story is wonderful. Anything that'll reconnect us with our founding fathers can't be wrong. I've heard that there's that someone has bought the operatic rights for Lincoln and the Bardo, which is a wonderful story. I thought the Spielberg Lincoln film was wonderful. It's curious to me that no one's tried to make a major film with Walt Whitman, which I think would be a really wonderful film. So, these are. I think that something like it was like when Jonathan Miller turned Tosca on its, or Rigoletto on its head, and made it Little Italy, and Klein Mafia, small mafia in Little Italy in New York. Everybody was appalled at this sort of. I found it very consistent. I found it very consequent, as it were. I didn't think that it. I don't think it was telling a different story. There are other producers today that are very well known, where you can feel that they sit down with a piece that they find very attractive in opera, and their first question is, well, what if that character wasn't actually that? And that kind of process doesn't particularly interest me. What interests me are these very, very talented producers who see the archetypes of personalities that may very well be captured in a particular context of the 19th century writer writing about the 18th century, but the archetype is a kind of timeless personality that could very well be seen to be manifested in a contemporary kind of personality that we would know today. That I find very interesting, because it leaves the heartbeat and the construction of the opera intact, but can somehow perhaps bring it more forward. I personally would like to see more modern opera written, and I think especially in America, where we have allowed, again, out of the academic forces of the 50s and the 60s, it's now okay to write a melody again. The polytonalities are accepted. Broadway's gotten more sophisticated. The opera is getting more ecumenical, as it were. I think these are very good and positive movements. I would like to see more pieces. I would like to see more. And that's why I did 2 world premieres last season, and I should have done another one this year. I'm very committed to that. I think that's very, very interesting. It's not easy work, but it's extremely rewarding work.
So there you have it. That was my interview with Thomas Hampson. Wasn't that absolutely amazing? Thank you very much for listening once again. There's a whole archive of interviews that I've done over the last 18 months or so with artists, creatives, practitioners, as well as musicologists. So do check those out. Meanwhile, I hope that you'll be able to join me for the next interview, which should be within the next fortnight or so. But in the meantime, stay safe,